Today's video is going to be a tough one to watch. I know it's been a tough one to make. Also, because of the nature of this video, there's not a lot of B-roll in places. But I felt the topic was more important than making sure you had cool things to look at, so let's get on with it. Scientists have been investigating global climate change since the early 19th century, theorising about how the planet's temperature has changed over time, according to both natural cycles and external sources. And it was the late 19th century when scientists really started to postulate that greenhouse gas emissions could have a detrimental effect on our climate. By the 1960s, it was no longer a theory. The scientific community was beginning to prove climate change theories together with irrefutable data from reproducible experiments and scientific observations. And in the last 50 years or so since, the effects of anthropogenic climate change have become more and more obvious. From my own childhood in the 1980s through to today, scientists have become more insistent than ever that we need to change our relationship with energy. Entire communities around the world have seen their homes threatened by freak weather event after freak weather event, rising sea levels, and as our news has made us all too aware in the hellish year that's been 2020, there's been a real transition in weather events that have seen once-in-a-lifetime storms become far more frequent. The warning signs of my youth have become an insistent three-bell alarm, and while many are now starting to pay attention, trying to change our energy usage, swearing off fossil fuel use where possible, and trying to reduce the impact our lives have on the planet, many are still ignoring it. Most, not all, climate experts warn that our time has all but run out, and now our attention should be on mitigating effects of climate change. But as we've learned several times in recent years, it needn't have been that way. World governments knew the risks from their own scientists. Most chose to ignore it. An investigative journalism piece from 2015 showed that oil companies like Exxon Mobil, who kept climate scientists on their payroll, knew way back in the late 1970s that increased amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels would cause climate change. And they then spent the next 40 years trying to deny that empirical data, funding climate change denial groups, and trying to pretend that everything was A-OK. And this week, thanks to a 5-month-long investigation by E&E News that carried out dozens of interviews with former staff and researchers, as well as delving into hundreds of pages of documents from both corporate archives and academic research, it's now pretty clear that Detroit's biggest automakers knew about the effects that burning gasoline would have on the environment. Like the Exxon news story of 5 years ago, we've now been given irrefutable evidence that both Ford and General Motors, and I'm guessing the majority of the other mainstream automakers out there, all knew. Suck, squeeze, bang, blow was slowly killing us. Which brings me to a difficult question, one that many of us have been asking ourselves, and one that some of you have even asked us to make a video on. If these companies knew and did nothing about it, choosing corporate greed and capitalism over the health and well-being of nations in the future, why should we be supporting these companies and buying their vehicles? Shouldn't we all just let them die off and support one company instead? That company obviously being Tesla. It is a topic that I've been thinking about for a really long time. Long, in fact, before this story broke. And so today I'm going to try and answer this in as pragmatic a way as I possibly can. What I'm going to say might upset some, maybe even make some enemies in the process, but I'm going to try and do my best to walk us through my own logic on the way. I'll look at who knew what and when, what the initial reaction was to it, and then examine what went wrong. Hint, it's got something to do with corporate greed. Then I'm going to ask what should be done about it, and finally answer the question that the video title poses, and explain why that time has already well and truly passed. Explain why, although all involved parties should be forced to make severe recompenses for their misdeeds, we're now at a point in history where it is all hands on deck, because this is about our survival, nothing less. First, let's deal with exactly what these companies knew and when they knew it. I'm not going to try and pass the excellent reporting of E&E News into a video, so I suggest you go and read the full article. I'll link to it in the show notes. But early researchers into climate science who were on the payroll of large automakers were charged with understanding carbon dioxide emissions from vehicles and potential mitigations that could be made to offset them. For example, in the 1960s, many GM executives actually thought that the tiny particles that come from vehicles, power plants and factories, aerosols, could negate the warming effects of increased carbon dioxide emissions. Science proved otherwise. Reporting from E&E News shows that both GM and Ford scientists were forthright about their findings, and both scientists at GM even published their findings in peer-reviewed journals. Both automakers appeared, back then at least, to be cognizant of the fact that burning fossil fuels led to climate change, and seemed to expect the governments of the world to step in and start legislating to reduce emissions. Their investigations into climate science seemed to be with the intent of being ahead of public policy and being able to react to any policy decisions well in advance. And in fact, fuel economy, less so for emissions, became a primary target, and with the rise in oil prices and gasoline shortages in the late 60s and 70s, both GM and Ford experimented with electric vehicles, as did many other automakers. There was even a little boost for EVs when GM helped provide the drivetrain for the Lunar rover, a vehicle which was originally going to be powered by a hydrogen fuel cell, but which switched to a pair of 36-volt silver zinc potassium oxide non-rechargeable batteries instead. And if you don't believe me in how seriously some of these companies were taking EVs, check out the Pathé News link below, which shows just some of the electric vehicles being happily discussed by automakers back in the 1960s. The same is true in the 70s. In fact, my love affair of electric cars started when I was very little in the early 80s. I was one of those precocious, annoying kids who learned to read at a very young age, primarily because my sisters were 10 and 15 years older than me, and I spent many hours reading non-fiction science books and periodicals, dreaming of a day when I would own my own electric car. But in the mid to late 1980s, something happened, something that I feel is a turning point in this whole climate science denial. It's marked perhaps by the change in the White House resident. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter installed solar panels on the roof of the White House. That was 40 years ago. Correction, 41 years, as my birthday this Sunday is all too eager to remind me. But after President Reagan came into power in 1981, those solar panels were removed, and with a Republican in the White House who publicly despised renewable energy and was perhaps one of the first climate-skeptical leaders, the attitude towards climate change visibly changed at companies like Ford and General Motors, and by the time NASA scientist James Hansen testified to US Congress in 1988 that he had a, quote, high degree of confidence that greenhouse gas emissions from us humans, our cars, our factories, and our power stations were causing climate change, well, automakers were eager to prove otherwise. Just like the oil and gas industry, automakers piled into skeptic camps, ignoring warnings of their own scientists decades before, and turning to their PR departments to polish the metaphorical turd. PR departments, not scientists, were at the forefront of casting doubt as to the origins of global warming, while scientists who had worked for the auto industry, as well as oil and gas industries, remained steadfast in their opinions, sometimes even internally at the companies involved. Public relations were more interested in spin. By the time Bush Sr. was in the White House in 1989, shareholder interest and profit were put before anything else. Gasoline wasn't expensive anymore, and there was no gasoline shortage, and thus attention at automakers shifted from protecting their future through innovation and diversification of fuel choices towards cashing out. Capitalism had replaced innovation and environmentalism, and both Ford and General Motors joined the Global Climate Coalition. And like the name might suggest, its main goal was to prevent President H.W. Bush from setting emission reduction targets at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And then, subsequently, when President Bill Clinton had become the new resident of the White House, to try and stop him from ratifying the Kyoto Protocol. If we're tracking the journey to evil for both of these firms, I would submit that we're now both at the full-blown supervillain monologue stage. While E&E's reporting shows that top GM executives had been briefed decades ago about climate change, it couldn't say for sure if the same had happened at Ford, but by the time both were campaigning actively against climate protection medals and spreading information about climate change science, I think it's fair to say that a large part of the company's executive teams knew exactly what was going on. Frankly, some of the adverts made at the time, both in print and aired on television and radio, are spookily similar to some of the adverts we're seeing in the current election cycle, casting emissions reductions as somehow an enemy of the American way of life, American freedom, and only a cause of economic damage. But put a pin in that, because I'm going to come back to that in a second. Between 1985 and 1997, Ford and General Motors donated millions of dollars to various conservative think tanks whose sole purpose was to dispute scientific consensus on global warming. GM continued to 2008. While other automakers aren't listed, I'm pretty sure they played a part too. Into the 90s, Ford and GM still resisted cleaner fuel choices. A GM research fellow in 1990 said that, quote, if global warming develops into a serious problem, cars can be operated without fossil fuel. Leading options include battery electric cars. Along with that statement, though, we were given warnings of an economic uncertainty over a full switch to battery electrics. Batteries were viewed as not ready for electric cars, and the optimism of the 60s, where both Ford and General Motors, as well as other companies, openly suggesting that we would see millions of cars on the roads powered by electricity in the near future, well, that was all replaced with skepticism. When electric cars were produced under duress between the late 90s and early years of the 21st century, automakers were still trying to turn the attention away from EVs and back to gasoline vehicles. And we know how that ended, right? That push towards ever larger, ever more powerful trucks and SUVs has of course been spearheaded by mainstream automakers, with the Detroit 3 at the front of the pack. Even today, we are seeing ever increasingly large trucks and SUVs being advertised and sold, while smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles are being cancelled with the argument that nobody is buying them. And that's the same argument that was used for years to argue against hybrid and battery electric vehicles. All automakers, including Ford and GM, have managed to improve vehicle efficiency as a consequence of tightening emission regulations around the world. But with a current administration hell-bent on removing environmental protections and labelling them as bad for the economy, I should remind you that nearly 100 environmental protections have now been rolled back by President Trump's administration, they're also not as invested in making electric vehicles as they should and could be. Yes, General Motors, Ford, and every other automaker out there with any interest in selling vehicles globally beyond 2025 have now seriously spent a lot of money trying to catch up with Tesla in the green car segment. And the vehicles that are coming to market should be celebrated because they're another choice for consumers. More choice means more people will switch. Which, by the way, is why I think that the Hummer EV, while an oversized exercise in excess, will actually be a good thing if it can get a hardened gearhead who would never have considered going electric before making the switch. Which brings me to my conclusions. Did General Motors, Ford and others, as well as major oil companies, know what was happening with carbon dioxide levels, knowing the impacts and the cause of it? Abso-bloody-lutely. But society and government allowed them to behave in a way that meant they were not accountable for their actions. And we, society, haven't been accountable for our actions either. It has been all too easy to buy cheap cars and cheap gasoline. It's been all too easy to buy cheap goods and cheap food without really knowing or understanding, or dare I even say it, caring about the social and environmental consequences of what we're doing. Now it's time for us all to reap what we've sowed for more than half a century. So what do we do now? Time is running out and we are very nearly boned, and warn some experts, unless the US changes its policies to transportation and energy very quickly and helps lead by example, working internationally to lower emissions around the world and push towards renewable energy and sustainable transportation through leadership, the future is very bleak for our children. Without getting too heavily involved in politics, because I know it is a difficult subject, those of us in the US who are voting next week are voting for our future, but also for the world's future. One candidate says climate change is a hoax and claims wind turbines kill birds and cause cancer. The other says we need to transition our energy towards a more sustainable, equitable solution through massive investment and a science and technology push that hasn't been seen since the Apollo moon program. Yes, we need to go back to the trust of and investment in science that we had half a century ago. As to Ford, General Motors, and any other automaker or energy company that willingly participated in misinformation campaigns, and to some extent still do, GM, Toyota, others, reparations are due. Automakers have for decades made money off the lack of environmental consequences of their vehicles, and any future for these companies mean that reparations must be forthcoming. Large reparations. If Volkswagen can pay for its willingness to screw the environment through Dieselgate, so too should these companies pay hard and deep through financial penalties, fines, and yes, even criminal charges against those PR executives and teams who were responsible for anti-climate change actions over the last 30 years. Those fines should be used towards helping those already impacted by climate change, as well as establish development of new technologies that don't rely on fossil fuels. And had this all happened 20 years ago when we had time, I maybe would be having a different conversation. I'd maybe be more keen to suggest that boycotting companies was a way forwards. But right now, in our triple alarm state, we don't have that luxury. It's all hands on deck. We need as many electric car choices as possible. Tesla makes great products, but it's not producing enough variety of models to help rapidly transition the world to zero emission. And Tesla's goal has never been to eliminate the competition, but to help accelerate that transition. And it's done that. Most electric vehicle programs run by mainstream automakers today are direct responses to Tesla's market dominance, as well as legislation around the world designed to force them to make more electric vehicles. But as Volkswagen has already demonstrated with its ID.3, at least if initial reports are anything to go by, its Dieselgate past does not mean it's incapable of making competent, good electric vehicles. The ID.3 is getting rave reviews and people who have them seem happy with their cars. In the same way, I expect the Ford Mustang Mach-E to be popular with customers. The Bolt EV, while criticised by many, is generally liked by those who own them. And disclaimer, I own two. And while both Ford and General Motors should totally be held accountable for their past crimes, yes, they are crimes. Cars that are now being made should not be ignored or played down, especially if they allow people who would otherwise not be able or want to make the switch to electric to make that switch. In an ideal world, we'd have more choice. We don't. And we can't rely on one company to transition everyone. This is a group effort. As I noted to someone on Twitter earlier, while there are plenty of electric vehicles I would personally not buy, the GMC Hummer EV among them, I will champion any fully electric model over an internal combustion engine one. Because as I've said multiple times, time is running out. Just as wartime criminals have been forced to pay for their crimes, let's make sure those responsible for this pay, and let's hold those in power accountable now for their misdeeds. But let's make sure we don't tar everyone with the same brush, or worse still, put someone off buying an EV that fits their needs and their budgets because of bad things a company has done in the past. We lost that luxury years ago, and everyone watching this, every single one of us, paid our part in letting those companies behave that way. We all need to remember that. Most people watching purchased a gas car at some point. We all need to help the world transition away from gasoline today, and that means having as much choice as possible. That's it for today's video. As always, thanks to the folks on my right for being our $15 to $49 a month Patreon supporters. Special thanks to our $50 a month patrons, that's John Lyons, Regine Fellows, Jeffrey Songster, and Tesla in the Gong. And our deepest gratitude to our $100 a month Patreon supporters, Marcel Ward, Reggie Watts, JP Fagerback, Sean Ueda, Ian, and Will Graylin. You can join all of these amazing Patreon supporters by following the links below, or you can send us a donation through Ko-fi or Bitcoin. You'll also find a link to our free Discord server, so come on in and join in the fun. And if you're in need of some swag, do check out our Redbubble swag, especially as it's nearly the holidays. So buy something for someone who likes the show, support the channel, get a gift, all in one go. After the names have finished scrolling, you'll see a suggestion to watch for a new video from this channel, so please consider watching it if you haven't, and I'll be back very soon. Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep evolving!